Hello, welcome back to the Metahumanism podcast. Today's episode is a special feature of sorts. It's dedicated just to one topic, looking at the origins of the 11-year war with Russia, that Russia started by invading Crimea and the Donbass region in 2014. Subsequent to the Euromaidan protest movement, which became known as Revolution of Dignity. And escalating that war in 2022 in the February with a full-scale invasion. It is now, there's no doubt that it's accurate to describe it as a genocidal, imperialist war. It's also ecocidal and cultural-cidal, and we'll talk about that. It's unprovoked aggression, and I will be dispelling the many historical and current myths surrounding that conflict. For those of you who are new to my channel, I'm Bohdan, and this is the 7th episode of my podcast. I encourage you to watch the introductory series about me, this channel, and why it's called Metahumanism, and all the other videos I've recorded to date. This episode may be also seen as a kind of a sort of practical application of certain things I discussed in two of my previous videos, which focused on epistemology, or a study of knowledge, truth, facts. So this is just an example of when truth, facts, and knowledge matter, and how knowledge gets constructed and distorted throughout history. So it is also an exceptionally important episode. I said it was the most important. The last episode was the most important. Well, this is even more important, I would say, because it addresses the importance of understanding the truth about history, correcting the false imperialist historical narratives that have been dominant for centuries, and establishing a clear factual basis for understanding the nature of this conflict. Without that, the resolution of the war, of the conflict, will continue to remain elusive if you misunderstand the roots of the conflict and how deep it goes. And all the lives lost will be in vain, and the global security will continue to be threatened. So it's not just some local Ukrainian and Russian issue that doesn't concern anybody else. It's a global security issue, and everybody is interested in resolving this conflict in a lasting and manner that brings justice and peace. So, as I already mentioned, the war has turned fully genocidal. Ukrainian children are being kidnapped and re-educated in Russia to hate Ukraine, and trained to later join the Russian military and go fight against Ukraine, their own country, against the Ukrainian armed forces. There's horrific persecution, torture, and killings of various religious minorities in the occupied areas of Ukraine. The Baptists, the evangelicals, the Catholics, the Muslims, the Jews are persecuted. Everybody who doesn't fit into the Russian Orthodox dominant worldview, and Russian Orthodoxy is actually the church, Russian Orthodox Church. It's a tool of the KGB, and today it's called FSB, the Security Services of Russia, Russian Federation. It's this continuation of KGB culture, and the church has always been the tool, just a tool of the state and tool of the secret services. It was infiltrated by the services in the Soviet times, and it continues to be so. It's a tool of control. It's not separate from the state, and it's not independent, and it's not really religious. It's a political tool. There's constant bombardment of civilian targets: hospitals, museums, theaters, children's playgrounds. Recently in Kryvyi Rih and Sumy, children are killed all the time. You know, civilians who are not participating in the combat. There's erasure and destruction of entire cities. No major cities have been captured, thankfully, outside of the Donbass area. But, the middle-sized towns and cities, Mariupol, Bakhmut, and many others have been occupied or destroyed completely because of the fighting. It's a vast scale of destruction. And then there's consistent use of torture and even sexual abuse and violence against the captured captured POWs, the prisoners of war, male prisoners of war, that specifically just to break them psychologically, and it's just barbaric. And there's much more, but these are just some of the dimensions of the conflict. It is also an ecocidal war. Yesterday I took part in the Ukrainian Institute of America event dedicated to the Earth Day about the destruction and the effects this war is having on the ecological system in Ukraine and beyond, in global ecology. Because the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam on Dnipro River, on the Dnipro in 2023 is one big example. The industrial scale minefields that will require demining for years to come. The water mines in Black Sea included in that also. The destruction of forests and agricultural lands, disruption of food exports to, Ukraine feeds a lot of people in the world, in Africa, in Asia, and it's been disruptive. Attacks against the Chernobyl nuclear plant, luckily no major damage, but and the capture of the Zaporizhian nuclear plant, which is the largest in Europe, plant of that kind. It's still occupied by the Russians. Nobody knows what the future holds. And also the enormous volumes of greenhouse gases that are being released because of the war and all the fighting. So these are just a few examples. And that's the outcome. And the war is completely on Russia. It's their fault, their unprovoked aggression, and there's no two ways about it. That's a very clear fact of the matter. So there's a lot of propaganda, but it's all lies and falsehoods about the origin of the war. So let's begin examining the myths one by one. The task is twofold. First is to deconstruct the firmly entrenched and established historical myths that have persisted through centuries because of the imperialist narrative produced by Moscow and the Kremlin, and secondly to counter the propaganda lies of about the current war and the events leading up directly to the current war. They're related, but we'll start with the historical myths. So myth number one is Russia is the rightful heir to the Kyivan Rus state. That's the medieval state in the Eastern Europe. And Slavic tribes were created a state in the 9th and 10th century. It was pretty dominant, one of the largest European states at the time, very controlled trade routes from the Baltics to the Black Sea, from Asia to Europe. So it was a kind of a cross-section of trade routes and very, very powerful state. So Russia, the myth is that Russia is the natural and sole successor to the medieval Kyivan Rus civilization. The reality is Kyivan Rus was a multi-ethnic, decentralized polity centered in Kyiv. So there were different principalities coordinated from Kyiv. Kyiv was the main prince, the main king, you could say, who controlled and coordinated, and everybody kind of owed their fealty to Kyiv prince. But they were semi-autonomous principalities that made up that state, and Moscow didn't even exist back then. Okay, Moscow emerged in the 11th to 20th centuries, and it was on the northern outskirts of Rus, and was not even a prominent city until much later. And we'll talk about that. So Ukraine and Belarus also inherit from this legacy, not just Russia. The appropriation of Kyivan Rus by Muscovy, that's the name of the state that emerged later before being renamed into Russia. It was Muscovy, Grand Duchy of Moscovia. And so it's a post facto myth. It's a constructed myth after the fact, which used to legitimize dominance over Ukraine, Belarus, and other territories beyond, in Asia as well, non-Russian territories. It would take too long for this episode to fully deconstruct all this notion of Moscow being the heir of Kyivan Rus, but but it is a fascinating history, complicated history, many twists and turns. But let me just summarize at least the main broad strokes about it. So the very name Russia dates back to only 1721, when Peter I the Russian Tsar changed it from Moscovia to Russia, Russia, and proclaimed himself to be the emperor of all Russias, right? So, Imperator Всероссийский. So he didn't say, he deliberately from Rus, Kievska Rus, to Russia, Rus to Russia, and called himself Imperator Всероссийский. So that's the small change between the Rus and the cultural, medieval cultural identity of Rus and the Russian, more early modern and modern Russia, Russian identity, imperial identity. There's already a discrepancy. In the wake of defeating, this happened in the wake of defeating Sweden in a Great Northern War at the beginning of 18th century. Prior to that, European powers all referred to state as Moscovia, and distinguished it from the broader cultural concept of Rus. That's how Moscow effectively stole the legacy of that medieval state, which was centered in Kiev, not Moscow, and appropriated it for themselves. The medieval state of Kyivan Rus fragmented internally due to internecine warfare between different princes, and as a result also it was unable to resist the Mongol invasion in the 13th century. The strongest descendant state that emerged from that fragmentation and the Mongol invasion was the Galician-Volhynian kingdom, which I mentioned in my very first video. That's where I come from, that territory of Lviv and Galicia. And King Danilo was he was actually crowned by the Pope at one point as a king, not just a mere prince. And he, or duke, he was crowned by a pope, and he created my city Lviv. It's a city of lion. It was dedicated to the son of the King Danilo, Lev, which means lion in Ukrainian. So Moscow was only still a minor trading outpost on the Moskva River in the north, and those northern outskirts of the Kyivan Rus, it was called Volodymyr Suzdal Principality at the time. It was thoroughly subdued and subjugated by the Mongols. They became vassals, and they were paying, collecting taxes and paying dues to the Mongol, the Golden Horde, as it was called. And subsequently, internal squabbles among Danilo's descendants in Galician-Volhynian kingdom led to also again to fragmentation and weakening decline of that kingdom. Was also called Ruthenian kingdom, from Rus, Ruthenian, and it included both Belarusians and Ukrainians. It was not differentiated at that time yet, and it was split by the rising Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. So they split up the Kingdom of Galicia and Volhynia. Volhynia went to Lithuania, and Galicia went to Poland. In the 14th century, this happened. And this introduced also a religious rivalry into the mix, because the Polish has always been and continues to be very Catholic, Roman Catholic, and the Lithuanians was actually pagans, but they adopted the Ruthenian Orthodoxy religion and customs, and pretty much it was the elite was Lithuanian, but most of the population of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania became, after the absorption of these lands, Volhynia and other lands, central Kiev and other environs, it became pretty much dominant. The Ruthenians were the largest part of the population, although not the elite. The elite was Lithuanian at the time. It was mixed. It became a little bit mixed with time, but that was the. There's a lot to be said, but it's for maybe another time. Myth number 2. Let's move on to myth number 2. Russia is always defending itself from Western aggression. So the idea is that Russian expansionism is portrayed as defensive against NATO, the West, and other imagined invaders. We'll talk about that in context of contemporary war in a minute, but in terms of historical facts, Russia has been the aggressor in most of its imperial wars against Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, against the Ottoman Empire, the Caucasus, the Central Asian peoples, Finland, Ukraine, and so on. The history of Russian empire is littered with wars it started against its neighbors, expansionist, aggressive wars. This quote-unquote defensive myth inverts the history to frame conquest and repression as self-preservation. It's like a victimhood complex, but based on a complete and total inversion, a lie. So as the Mongol, just for some context, as the Mongol rule started to decline and disintegrate in the 14th century, their dutiful vassal Moscow emerged as a regional power. So it started to become more independent, and its leaders embarked on aggressive expansionist policy of conquest, as I said, under the spurious claim to be collecting the lands of Rus. Собирание земель русских, they called it. It's styling itself. Also, they styled themselves as the third Rome, or a spiritual descendant of the Roman. That's the first Roman Empire, and then the Byzantine Orthodox Empire was the second Rome, and then Moscow was supposed to be a third Rome, third empire in that succession. This is a false myth. Complete appropriation of somebody else's legacy is persisted largely unchallenged to this day, actually. I mean, a lot of people still think of Russia as being some Orthodox defender of Orthodox faith and the last white hope and whatever. It's nothing further, could be further from the truth if one knows the historical context. The very title of Tsar comes from Caesar, right? The Roman Emperor Caesar title, and it was established by Ivan the Terrible, who was one of the most aggressive and well-known. That's why the name the Terrible, aggressive and frankly psychopathic rulers in the 15th century and 16th in that time frame, and they're related to Byzantine, the Caesaro-Papist theocratic tradition of Byzantine Empire, and then the Russians kind of combined the Mongol administrative practices with that idea of Caesaro-Papism, and that's why the church has always been the tool, Orthodoxy, a tool of the state and political tool. So Moscow's aggressive expansionism and exaggerated claims obviously led to repeated conflicts with the neighbors, Lithuania and Poland, throughout the 14th and 16th centuries, between 14th and 16th. Ultimately, it led to these two states, Lithuania and Poland, joining together and creating a dual elective monarchy. So the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, it was known. It was kind of a proto-democratic, aristocratic democracy kind of idea, and they elected the king. The parliament made up of nobles elected the king. And that was created towards the end of the 16th century, and then continued clashing with Russia. The Commonwealth was one of the most powerful states of the time, and most based on considerable liberties. At the time, it was considered relatively liberal in the sense that the nobles had the rights to vote, and obviously it was landowning gentry. Just like in America, their initial democracy was very limited to landowning people and aristocracy, and there was an elective monarchy. So the aristocratic democracy was with the parliament. There was a significant amount of religious tolerance. I mentioned there were different religions: Orthodoxy, paganism, Catholicism. So they had to create some kind of compromise. And there was a lot of cultural vibrancy with the Baroque culture at the time, and the kind of a unique cultural synthesis of this Catholic, Orthodox, and Ruthenian influences. And we'll talk about that, the Baroque culture and Ukrainian version of it in future videos. So Moscovia, on the other hand, was a characterized by a despotic, absolutist, autocratic system of rule exemplified by the historical figure, which I mentioned already, Ivan IV Terrible, and his infamous secret service called Oprichnina. And that tradition of of despotic, oppressive, and paranoid political culture has lasted pretty much largely unreformed to this day. Despite the various upheavals and even the Soviet experiment, didn't change the nature of the regime. Despite some common misconceptions, the Soviet ideology was not really different. It was just a mask. It was a facade for the continuity of the imperial structures that were consolidated by Stalin's terror and genocidal policies in 1930s in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution. Initially, the Bolsheviks thought they might ignite a world revolution, but when they realized that weren't going to happen, so they had to fall back on the pre-existing imperial structures in Russia, and they basically Stalinism just recreated the Tsarist regime with a communist ideology as a facade. So it was in practice, it was not much different in terms of how it treated other nationalities and how it viewed itself as this kind of Orthodox empire. Although not ostensibly, obviously, was atheist as a communist state, but the church still existed, and it was just infiltrated by KGB, and there was this uncomfortable alliance of this pretense of that we're all communists and atheists, but then there's still the church that exists. It everybody knew everything was based on a lie, but everybody had to pretend because it was all based on power and repression. So, in other words, the claim that Moscow, subsequently named Russia, so Moscovia, is the sole legitimate heir to the medieval state of Rus, is nothing but a tall tale and a fantasy concocted by the imperialist historians in the 18th and 19th century, in the wake of Peter I's claim to be the emperor of all Russias. And, they had to justify the claim and to somehow ground it in the historical narrative, and that's what they did. They constructed a lie. So it's introduced the substitution of this Russia, Rossiya, for Rus, or Kyivan Rus, and this was followed by a concerted, systematic effort to erase all traces of alternative claims to that legacy. So, meaning Ukrainian and Belarusian identities first and foremost. That brings us to myth number 3. There is no such thing as Ukraine or Belarus. We are one people. Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians are simply branches of a single Russian people. The reality is there are 3 distinct nations with different languages, different identities, different cultures, and different historical paths. The claim to a triune Russian nation or some pan-Slavic unity is used as a colonial narrative used to erase national identities and justify Russification and annexation. The Russian imperialism proceeded through what is known in historiography and social sciences as quote-unquote internal colonization. So unlike most of the European empires, such as British, French, Belgian, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, and even German, whose colonies were abroad, meaning overseas, not contiguous, the Russian Empire colonized the immediately contiguous territories like Ukraine, Belarus, the Asian steppes, all the way to the Pacific and so on. They're all non-Russian. The Russian Federation today is still an empire. They're all non-Russian territories that Russia, Moscovia, invaded, conquered, and repressed. After Moscovia became the Russian Empire in the 18th century, the history of the Russian-Ukrainian relations can best be characterized as the quote-unquote intent to destroy. I'm using that phrase because a book recently came out by Eugene Finkel, a scholar Eugene Finkel, who looks at this 2 or 3 century tradition policy, systematic policy to erase Ukrainian identity by the Kremlin, by the Tsarist, Soviet, and today Putinist regime in Russia, to erase both culture and language and all traces of differences. These are the real roots of the current war, and anyone who's ignorant of that is just effectively aiding the imperialists in the Kremlin, aiding Putin and all across Russia and the world, sympathizers of that kind of imperialism, buying into their lies and propaganda that claim that Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus are all one people, or один народ. No. Complete lie. Myth number 4. The Russian Empire or the Soviet Union brought civilization to backward peoples. So non-Russian nations were liberated, quote-unquote, or uplifted by Russian or Soviet rule. Again, another lie. Imperial and Soviet rule suppressed local languages, cultures, and institutions, and very violently in most cases. The quote-unquote civilizing mission rhetoric is just classic colonialism that masks exploitation, forced assimilation, genocidal policies like Holodomor in Ukraine, Asharshilik in Kazakhstan, Crimean Tatar persecutions and deportations, so also genocidal, and other Russification policies all across the 14 Soviet republics. Non-Russian nationalities were all oppressed by the Russian center. Moreover, the truth is that the the Ruthenian identity, which was before Ukrainian, Belarus identities became separated. They were both included into the Ruthenian identity, early modern period. So that culture was much more highly developed than the Moscovia culture, the Moscow culture. There were established centers of Orthodox civilizational knowledge and learning, such as Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in Kyiv, Ostrog Academy, that's a town of Ostrog in the Volhynia region of Ukraine. So they were all they had established schools of like rhetorics, logic. They trained the priesthood and so on in highly intellectual centers of learning and culture. These people, unfortunately, these intellectuals had this idea that they could civilize the empire and help create this kind of synthesis, new civilizational synthesis, and maybe create good conditions for a multi-ethnic society to exist. And this idealistic notion that could be possible was very quickly destroyed and disabused by the brutality of Peter I and Catherine II, their despotic rule. Who by the end of the 18th century, they destroyed the vibrant Cossack Baroque culture of the 16th and 17th century. They erased also the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. By the end of the 18th century, it was divided between the Russian Empire, the Prussian, and the Austrian Empire. Three different empires split up the Commonwealth, and it was erased from the map, Poland and Lithuania. And they faced a very similar fate to Ukrainian nation, statelessness for much of the history, early modern history. So there's much more to be said here. It's a complicated history and the tension between Polish and Ukrainian identities and so on, but that's not topic of this video. So I'll do a video in the future about that. Myth number 5. The Russian culture is inherently superior and unifying. Russian language and culture are universal, sophisticated, and naturally binding for all post-Soviet peoples. Another lie. The reality is that this myth ignores and marginalizes rich, distinct cultural traditions of Ukraine, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and all the other territories. The imperial promotion of Russian culture often came through suppression of native traditions and institutions. After the partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the complete destruction of the Cossack Hetmanate, that was the state created by the Ukrainian Zaporozhian host, as it was known, the Cossacks, the Free Cossacks, the newly formed Russian Empire embarked on its project to internally colonize these new areas and erase all traces of separate Ukrainian and Belarusian cultures, identities, languages. In the process of these cultures, Ukrainian and Belarusian, were in the process of making transition between the early modern and properly modern period, and they were snuffed out right at that. I mean, at least not completely snuffed out, obviously, but they were oppressed and repressed very heavily during this kind of transition, and it caused a lot of issues with the development and modernization of the Ukrainian and Belarusian identity. We're still struggling to decolonize that history. when the currents of modern romanticism and nationalism emerged throughout Europe and the world in 19th century, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus and other nationalities around Russia were severely oppressed and repressed and in serfdom. So that development did not affect Ukraine as much. It was delayed. The definition, self-determination, and the national independence. So the properly modern Ukrainian literature traces its beginning to the end of the 18th century, and to such names as Grigory Skovoroda. He was an itinerant philosopher known as the Ukrainian Socrates, and also known for his philosophy of the heart. And Ivan Kotlяревsky is another author who wrote the Ukrainian version of the Aeneid in the literary style of travesty, which is a satire, a parody of sorts, and subverting and deconstructing this Russian imperial mythology. He portrayed Aeneas as a Cossack, leading a host of Cossacks on a quest to found a new independent city, which obviously meant Ukraine, as a challenge to the official Russian myth of empire. And I will do a future video on this kind of a history of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Ukrainian Cossacks and the Baroque. Another prominent world-renowned name from the 19th century is Mykola Gogol, or Nikolai Gogol in Russian Russified way. He was a Ukrainian-born writer and whose identity was torn between this Ukrainian roots and the dominant imperial culture. He chose to write in Russian ultimately, but his language carried all of his language, even though it's Russian, it carries the distinct marks of Ukrainian syntactical and semantic characteristics. And the themes he wrote about were about this folklore of Ukrainian folklore and peasant life, romanticized to some extent. And he is a clear example of a phenomenon known as double consciousness, quote unquote, that was developed by American black sociologist at the beginning of 20th century called W.E.B. Du Bois. And he highlighted how the oppressed are forced to live with these two incompatible identities of their own self-understanding, and then the distorted views imposed on them by the oppressors. So obviously he was talking about the blacks in America, but this applies to any colony and empire where there is this double consciousness. Gogol's lyrical depictions of Ukrainian folkloric life contrast starkly with with his apocalyptic and absurdist depiction or portrayal of the so-called dead souls. That's one of his works, and bureaucracy, this deadening bureaucracy of the autocratic imperial Russia. So that tension is very visible in his works. And again, Russia tried to distort that and deny his Ukrainian nature and make fun of Ukrainian because he portrayed the Ukrainian culture a little bit this romanticized, a little bit underdeveloped provincial manner, and Russians kind of used that as a way to foster this inferiority complex that the Russians are the great ones and everybody else is inferior. But the fact that Russia bases its entire literature on Gogol and considers him the founding father of it, one of the founding fathers of its modern literary tradition, Russian literature, points to the deeply insecure foundation of the Russian imperial culture. This is part of the reason why the Kremlin sees control and domination of Ukraine as so existential, because they are like, they don't know who they are. If Ukraine is allowed to be independent and free and live self-determine their own future, who is Russia without empire? They don't have the identity. That's really the existential issue. It's not a valid or legitimate one, but that's the reason their politics is the way they are. And I will definitely record a video about Gogol in the future to examine this his works and so on in greater detail. It's fascinating to deconstruct the imperialist mythology. Another important contemporary of Gogol was Taras Shevchenko. He's a Ukrainian national poet, a prophet, and a mythmaker who in his poetry revived the glory of the bygone Cossack era, the Baroque culture, and he called for a mass popular uprising against the oppressive Russian imperial regime. He expressed deeply his love for Ukraine and his pain for that the Ukraine was enslaved to this corrupt despotic regime from Moscow. His powerful voice was subsequently followed by scores of others that built on his the beginning that he kind of the beginning foundation he laid down. And he also he built on Kotlяревsky and Skovoroda's and other achievements of Ukrainian intellectual tradition, and so the Ukrainian cultural, ethnographic, and populist movement emerged in the 19th century, in the second half of the 19th century, and then eventually took more political form. The parties were formed towards the end of 19th century, beginning of 20th. Political parties, many Ukrainian political parties of various ideological directions and platforms, but ultimately this kind of development of Ukrainian culture and political tradition culminated in the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917 to 1921, when the Ukrainian People's Republic was Українська Народна Республіка was proclaimed in the wake of the revolution in Russia and during World War I. I'm sorry. And unfortunately, for various very complicated constellation of factors, that revolution was unsuccessful. The Bolsheviks overran Ukraine and subjugated Ukrainians to the Soviet totalitarian rule. So one of the most famous poems by Shevchenko is his Testament. That's very short, very kind of terse, but very intense poem about what he wants to do when he dies. He wants to be buried, and then he calls for Ukrainians to rise up. And I will provide a link to a translation of that brief but powerful poem. It's one of the anthems, really, of Ukrainian national movement. So the claim to unity and superiority of Russian culture is completely belied by the facts of history, which Moscow just continued to suppress and wants to continues to lie about today in its propaganda, and it's done so for centuries, and that's why a lot of people are so ignorant about it. Fearful Russia and Moscow is fearful that if the truth is revealed and people learn about it more, and that's in fact that is what will happen, that this would shake the very foundations of their imperial identity and rule. And they can't allow that to happen, because no empire, no Russia in their minds. They can't, and so that explains their behavior and their politics and everything. Everything else is just an excuse, distortion, propaganda, and lies. So there were 5 myths so far. Myth number 6: Soviet victory in World War II justifies Russian dominance today. So because the USSR, led by Russia, dominated by Russia, defeated Nazi Germany, it earned moral authority and geopolitical privilege. That's the common conceit by the Kremlin, and Putin definitely today tries to play on that. The reality is that USSR included many nations, as I mentioned, Ukrainians, Belarus, Georgians, Central Asian republics, who paid an enormous price in World War II. And it wasn't just the Russians. Millions of Ukrainians and others died as well, fighting the Nazis. Stalin also collaborated with Hitler to start World War II. He signed the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, dividing Poland between himself and Hitler in 1939. And for 2 years, he was an ally of Hitler while Hitler overran Europe. And that's why Russia dates the beginning of the so-called Great Patriotic War against Hitler and the Nazis from 1941 to 1945. It's just a 4-year war for them. It's not World War II, and they mark it on May 9th, the Victory Day, not May 8th, like the rest of Europe, just because of that Stalinist propaganda that wants to deny the collaboration with Hitler between 1939 and 1941. And wants to present Stalin as an ally, always an ally, a victor, and an anti-fascist icon, but in fact he was just a fascist in the communist cloak. That's all. The Soviet project was just, as I said, it's a Russian imperialism in a new guise. It was a continued attempt to erase other cultural identities, kind of dressed in this Cold War rhetoric of internationalism, friendship of nations, anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, and so on. And which all of that were just lies and propaganda. It was clear to pretty much everybody, but everybody had to pretend within the Soviet Union, I mean. The Bolsheviks, it was also clear outside of the Soviet Union, I'm sure, but not, there was many useful idiots, so-called, that's Lenin's word, people who sympathized with Soviets and thought that they had some high ideals in mind. They were just corrupt and imperialist bastards from the day one. The Bolsheviks might have initially, as I said, they might have imagined that they could have ignited the world revolution, but that failed, and they just fell back on Russian imperialist structures, institutions of the Tsarist regime. It much like the French revolutionaries a century before that, in the end of the 18th century, the French revolutionaries pretended or thought they were creating something completely new, but they actually used the already existing centralized bureaucracy of the absolutist ancien regime, the royal regime, to create the new reality and to perpetrate terror against the population because of they didn't really know what they were doing. So that's a warning. It's a historical warning from French Revolution, from the Bolshevik Revolution, that that's why there's a saying that all major revolutions are conceived by the idealists, carried out by the fanatics, and ultimately hijacked by the scoundrels. So, and recent example of Ukraine itself is also proves that point in a way, both in the aftermath of the Orange Revolution of 2004 and the Revolution of Dignity of 2013 and 14. Started well. The people who made the revolution were idealistic, democracy, better civil rights, less corruption. But then, those behind the scenes who then, once the revolution was over, captured the power, and they were the same corrupt people with the same corrupt interests, and disappointed people. Everybody else was disappointed and disillusioned. That's what happens when revolutions take place. It's always, there's this solidarity and rising of solidarity and ideals, and then there's an inevitable disappointment when the realities kick in. So unfortunately, that's how it works. So this is obviously a heuristic, reminding the last video I talked about the facts and the heuristic as a rule of thumb, right? It's not always true that revolutions are that way, but very often that's how it happens. Idealists create the conditions, and then fanatics or those who are passionate about it make it happen, and then the scoundrels, the corrupt or the power hungry reap the results, the benefits. Okay, myth number 7. Russian speaking means pro-Russian. Another lie. Russian-speaking populations in neighboring countries, the myth goes, naturally identify with or support Russia. Total lie. Reality is that language does not determine political loyalty. Many Russian, does the USA belong to Britain or any other, Australia, Canada, every English-speaking part of territories on this planet belongs to Britain because they speak English? No, right? The same thing is here. Many Russian-speaking Ukrainians in Odessa or Kharkiv or even Donbass, they resist Russian imperialism. This myth is used to justify invasions and the annexation of regions under the pretext of protecting Russian speakers, quote unquote. Who asked you to protect? Nobody asked you. You just use that as a pretext to invade and wreak havoc and destruction. Moreover, the very history of how these populations became Russian speakers is already a testament to imperialism, because the population inhabiting the eastern and southern part of what today is Ukraine became Russian-speaking by assimilation, by forceful, violent assimilation. The fact of the matter is that Russian Empire forcibly resettled Russians into those areas, specifically ethnic Russians, deliberately, and deported Ukrainian-speaking ones, or forced them to assimilate and adopt Russian language instead of Ukrainian, and Russified whoever was left behind. So this cultural kind of murder, cultural side, is also evident in today's war, where Russia persecutes everything, all things Ukrainian, all things Crimean Tatar Muslim, all things Jewish in the occupied territories. Everything that's non-Russian, non-Orthodox, not aligned with the dominant imperial narrative and cultural identity that they want to impose on everybody else and make everybody the same, they persecute those. Evangelical Christians. Myth number 8. The collapse of the USSR was a geopolitical catastrophe. That's a famous quote by Putin. Back in the 90s, he said this, and he continues to believe it. Obviously, he wants to reestablish the empire in some guise or other. And he thinks that dissolution of the Soviet Union was a disaster and must be reversed to restore greatness and historical justice, in his view. Reality is the collapse of the Soviet Union freed many nations from colonial rule. 15 republics, including Russia. So 14 other nationalities were subjugated to the Russian dominant imperial culture and power structure. This myth that USSR collapse was a disaster, it reimagines empire as some stability and peace and some kind of heaven to live in that it provided for people. No, it was an oppressive, totalitarian, inhuman regime of the gulags, the genocides, the psychological damage, the constant corruption, this kind of every sixth person was forced to collaborate with KGB and rat on their co-workers or students he would study with, or it's created this huge psychological trauma, and the attempts to erase the culture or entire cultures. It was a prison of the nations, as it was known. It was an evil empire. There's no two ways about it. It's just a historical fact. Just like the Nazis, the Soviets were horrible, no less than terrible in the effects and the practices and the outcomes. Maybe even more so over time, because they were allowed to continue their regime for so long. Unlike the Nazis, they were defeated, and denazification happened in Germany after that, and Marshall Plan and so on. The Soviets were never punished. The communism was never punished. Mao, the Soviets, and other criminal regimes. Putinism is nothing else but a return to those well-established historical policies that allow for no space for other cultures to exist or thrive. Okay, so it's just it's genocidal, totalitarian kind of approach. Myth number 9, the Orthodoxy binds the Russian world, Ruski Mir. The Russian Orthodox Church unites the Eastern Slavs and legitimizes a sacred Russian civilization. That's the myth. I already addressed it, that's not true. It's just it's a constructed myth that doesn't reflect the actual practices in reality. It politicizes religion. It turns it into a tool of state power and cultural imperialism. Many Orthodox believers reject Moscow's control or the idea of this singular Russian world, Eurasianist. It's almost a fascist. Alexander Dugin is an ideologue of this Eurasianism and this new kind of civilizational synthesis based on this imperialist myth. And it's a very fascist way of looking at things. It's again totalitarian, genocidal, fascist kind of erasure of everything that is not my way or death, sort of. It erases pluralism and any local religious traditions. Okay, and lastly, myth number 10. Russia is the victim of cancel culture and historical revisionism. Criticism of Russia's past or present is unfair, Western propaganda, or Russophobia. Okay, so this is again victimhood complex, inversion of the reality. Russia's actual actions, which is imperialism, repression, wars, genocides, are being kind of couched in these terms of victimhood myth that, you know, the Russia is a victim of Western evil or Western capitalism or Western imperialism or whatever else, and NATO expansion and so on, the corrupt West, the gay Europe, or the imperialist America. Those are the paranoid and absolutely false mythology that's being constructed, has been constructed through the decades, and is continuing to be constructed by Putin. He just builds on that tradition and just continues developing it, adding new dimensions to it. Presenting himself as traditionalist, fighting the global elites and defending the traditional culture, against the gay, the LGBT, the liberals, or whatever else, whatever suits his propaganda, as long as he can keep his kleptocratic fascist regime under his total control. He will say anything and lie about anything. That's where the post-truth propaganda comes from, and Trumpism kind of took it. It's just another iteration of the same approach to politics. So I think that's a good place to stop for today. So we only got halfway through. So we got through 10 historical myths, and then next video I will record shortly, in a few days, will be about 10 contemporary myths about the current conflict in Ukraine. There will be a lot of echoes, but we will look specifically at the events of the last 11 years. Thank you for listening. Please support Ukraine in whatever way is good, the best and possible for you. I include links in every video description. Also, please support my content and my effort to create these videos. Like, share, subscribe, tell your friends about it, let them listen to this. Everything I've said, I will provide as many links as I can to back up everything I've said. Links to the books, historical, maybe articles, online resources. Nothing I've said, everything is based in truth, historical truth, and contemporary truth. And we will continue this examination in the next episode. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.